They used to say that the so-called Arab Spring that started 5.5 years ago with high expectations of democracy and stabilization very rapidly turned out to be a very cold Islamic winter. With instability, with violence, with extremism. We can talk, of course, about this, what used to be the state of Syria, now becoming the battleground torn apart between 4 different entities that not only fight the regime, fight each other. We can talk about Iraq, of course, no longer Iraq. And we can talk about ISIL, the Islamic State. ISIL that was established more than a decade ago, but the ground for its flourish was the collapse of the state system in the Middle East. That's what made ISIL so powerful entity in the region right now. So when you walk in Jerusalem, you can hear the senior officials saying that the Sykes-Picot agreement formed and shaped the Middle East for more than 100 years, almost 100 years, is no longer exist and cannot be restored. And that's a point that we wish to discuss today. So in this new order of the Middle East, apart from the tactic question of how can the West win ISIS, the war on ISIS, for instance, there is a basic strategic question, and that is it possible to restore stability in the Middle East? And however, what is the right policy and right measures to be taken by Western governments? In order to enhance such a stability in this reality. And these important questions we wish to address and to discuss with this A-list kind of experts on the issue. So please join me in welcoming, first of all, Dan Chugg, head of, let me be accurate. I want to be accurate. Okay. Dan Chugg, who is the head of the British government ISIL task force, then heads up the government cross-department ISIL task force that brings together staff from the Foreign Office, Ministry of Defense, and Department for International Development and others. The former political counselor at the UK Embassy to China also leads the FCO's Iraq department. Thank you, Dan. Oded Eran, my fellow from Israel, senior research fellow at INSS in Tel Aviv, a long career in Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs, includes a stint as Israeli ambassador to Jordan shortly after the peace treaty was signed. He was also Israeli ambassador to the EU and head of Israel's negotiation team with the Palestinians in the years 1999-2000. Jane Kinninmont, deputy head of Middle East and North Africa program, Chatham House. Jane cut her teeth as Middle East and North Africa editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit, later fulfilling a similar role at Business Monitor International, a regular media commentator. Her specialist area include sectarianism and the development of opposition movement in the region. And last but not least, Mr. Alan Mendoza. Hi, Alan. Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Alan founded Henry Jackson Society, a foreign policy and security think tank, 15 years ago, while still at Cambridge University. He is also present at Tory discussion group at the Israeli Union and stood as conservative candidate for Grand Central in this year's general election. Thanks you all for being here. And Shlomo Avineri, another Israeli expert, used to be Director General of the Foreign Ministry in Israel, couldn't make it due to personal reasons, but we wanted him to come, and he couldn't for personal reasons. Then I want to start with you. The UK was the first country to join President Obama's coalition performed against ISIS. And it has been 9 months since then. And it's true that ISIS had some defeats, and the Western coalition had some, I would say, wins here and there. But overall, it seems either a lack of will to invest the sufficient and needed resources into this war, bearing in mind the no boots on the ground saying by President Obama, or is it maybe the point then to say publicly and honestly that in this form of coalition, ISIL cannot be defeated? And I want all us to bear in mind what President Obama said, that the goal is to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL, something that is not really what meets the eyes right now in the Middle East.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. I think, yes, the goal is to degrade and to defeat ISIL, and it's worth looking at the different aspects of that campaign, what that means, because it's not just a military campaign. So there is a military campaign, as people know, and there are airstrikes happening in Iraq and airstrikes happening in Syria. The first thing to say is why are those airstrikes happening? And the reason is they're happening because the Iraqi government requested some help with airstrikes, but hasn't actually requested help for putting troops on the ground. So the coalition forces are there at the request of the Iraqi government to help them defend themselves against the march of ISIL, the advance of ISIL. And they're actually in Syria for the same reason, which is actually to help protect the Iraqi government from ISIL, which operates without borders really between Syria and Iraq. So that's why the coalition is there militarily. I think it's fair to say that ISIL is not going to be degraded and defeated by airstrikes alone, and I don't think anybody thinks that they will be. But nevertheless, they have been, their march has been prevented. And so if you look at the ground that ISIL actually hold now in Iraq, it's about 25% less than it was at the start of the year. Their military equipment has been degraded, their fighters have been degraded, and they're not in anything like the same mode that they were of expansion this time last year. So I think it's fair to say that the military action has achieved something, and it continues to achieve something, but it's not going to by itself defeat ISIL. But then there are other aspects of the coalition as well. It's not just a military coalition. We had a meeting here in London of the so-called small group in January, where we created some working groups across the coalition, and they are covering, as well as the military side, they're covering ISIL's finances and how you squeeze them, foreign fighters and how you prevent them getting into that region and fighting. Stabilization plans, particularly in Iraq. So it's all very well clearing areas, liberating areas from ISIL, but unless you've got a plan to how to deal with that city the very next day, then you're not really going to solve many problems. In fact, you might create some problems. And lastly, a strategic communications working group, which is looking at how you counter the narrative of ISIL, how you damage the brand of ISIL, how you try and counter some of the quite clever things that they're doing in the social media sphere. And so these working groups exist, and the work is going on. And I won't go through them all and explain everything that's happening with each one, but maybe just to take financing as an example. This time last year, ISIL were looting areas that they were taking over, and that was a source of income. They were selling oil, which they were refining in Syria, and that was a source of income. They were having donations from countries, particularly in the Gulf, and they were also having income from ransom payments for kidnapping. Through the work of international organisations, not just the coalition, but the UN and other places, all of those sources of income really have been very much squeezed. The refineries have been were hit by airstrikes, so they can't smuggle oil out to the same degree. Donations have stopped as a result of international lobbying. Kidnap ransom has pretty much stopped as a result of precautions of people taking. And so if you look at their financial situation, it's far less sustainable now than it was a year ago. They're resorting really to extortion and taxation in the areas they control. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk more about this, but that, I think, gives an indication of where the coalition action is actually having some impact.
Just to articulate a little bit, is it still the policy of the UK government that no boots on the ground, only airstrikes, and where it leads us? Because for the external observer, it might look as a never-ending war that may be going to be with us for the foreseeable future. So either the policy saying that it's not defeatable in the foreseeable future, we have to live with it, we can minimize the power of ISIS, or the policy is how to see a defeat of ISIS, that is to use different measures that has been taken up until now.
Well, firstly, yes, it is the policy that there will be no combat troops on the ground, or combat boots on the ground. The Prime Minister announced the other day that there would be extra people going in for training, and there are people in Iraq for training purposes. But in terms of combat, that's right. And as I said, there's been no request from the Iraqi government to do that. But I think that in terms of defeating ISIL, it's not going to happen by the coalition action alone. It has to happen by having political solutions in Iraq and Syria. And so our policy is to try and support the Iraqi government as much as we possibly can to create a political situation in which it's more difficult for ISIL to thrive. So they need to be a more inclusive government, have measures which are less sectarian by nature, draw back from some of Prime Minister Maliki's policies that created some of these problems. They need to give security, particularly to the Sunni communities, because without that kind of security guarantee, then firstly they have no reason to particularly to push out ISIL, but secondly they're not going to be welcoming a Shia-led force coming into their cities to liberate them. So it's political work that needs to be done. So what we want to do is to do as much as we can to support the Iraqi government with that, to encourage other countries to support the Iraqi government, particularly its close neighbours in the Gulf, and to be there to offer Vardi any support that he needs.
Okay, thanks. I just want to make a small comment. We will have a first round of comments by the panelists, and then we will open for the public for like about 4 questions, and so we can have enough time for each panelist to answer. We'll take each question from the public to a certain panelist. And then I want to turn to you. Do you share this point of view that overall we can see a direction and moving forward of the war of the coalition against ISIL? And what is your take as of how the regional players, that is Iran, the Iraqis, the Syrians maybe, view the West, the Western superpower, as being involved in the region, or maybe vice versa? So the current coalition maybe impose the perception that they are withdrawn from the region.
Okay, so let's look at the progress first. Dan is right. If you look at the territorial situation, ISIL have certainly moved back from their sort of high watermark at the start of the year. So that's been the case, and they've seen some reverses there. That said, they're still capable of mounting offensives. We've seen that in the last month even. We've seen their attempts to come back at various points, and they're clearly not degraded to the point where they are on the back foot permanently. They're still able to do things. And it's really a question, I think, of speed. Yes, I take on board exactly what Dan's saying about working groups. Progress is being made in areas, but it is slow progress. Having just been to Washington, for example, there's a sense of frustration amongst many Americans at the slow progress. I mean, this, after all, is supposedly the most mighty militaries in the world that we have here, and we are dealing with still a fairly weak ground force. But the method of engagement is such that we're not able to bring overwhelming power to bear on the terrorists. Now, the issue there is twofold. I think part of it is the request by the Iraqi government. It's quite true that we were asked to supply air power in this way, but that hasn't seemingly stopped the Iranians from entering the fray on the ground. I'm not aware of an official sort of welcome from the Iraqi government for Iranian forces, but they're there. So there are clearly grey areas in terms of what's happening on the ground in certain parts, and I think a lot of the success on the ground hasn't been, unfortunately, from the Iraqi army itself, but from the independent Shia militias, which complicates matters if you're looking to retake Sunni territory. If Shia militias lead that's going to be problematic. And I think the worst thing that could happen on the ground is if we allow the Shia militias to take the offensive, as opposed to the Iraqi army, as ineffective as it is, because that will lead to if you like, a pushback from the Sunni areas, if and when the Shias get there and if ISIS gets pushed back. And the one thing we learned from the surge, you saw the success of the surge back in 2007, 2008, 2009, was that you needed the Sunni tribes in Anbar, in particular province, to come on board as well as the Shias in order to forge some kind of consensus. That's, after all, what defeated Al-Qaeda in the first stage on the ground. And that's, of course, significant ground troops from the West. Now, I don't see the ground troop situation changing from our part. It's interesting, the US have now decided finally to get back engaged with military trainers at the very least, which has caused controversy. I'm not sure President Obama will want to extend that, having made such a big thing about, wrongly in my view, about having left Iraq. Nonetheless, I don't think he wants to come back before he leaves office. That would, I'm sure, be seen as a failure on his part. So we may have to settle for stasis, or at the very least a gradual pushback over the next 18 months to 2 years until he actually leaves office. What the next US president does is, of course, something very different. The one area I think where we can look at some progress in Britain's case is in Syria. Now, as we know, we're not part of the Syrian airstrikes because of the votes in Parliament back in 2013. Now, I would argue that circumstances have changed quite dramatically here since then, not least in public opinion. And whereas there was a vote at the time against attacking Mr. Assad and enforcing the chemical weapons red line, I think that might be different today. I think we might want to see some leadership from our politicians to perhaps get back into the Syria game as such and be part of the solution there. Then we're just on the sidelines of it. Of course, we're diplomatically engaged, but we're not engaged in military operations. I think we need to be engaged for change to happen there. And it's quite clear as well that in the longer term there, that the Syrian situation, Iraq's one thing, Syria is a different problem. Here we have to have the removal of Mr. Assad. Not necessarily his regime now. We've got to a point now where things have developed a lot from where they were 2-3 years ago. But he himself cannot possibly stay in charge. He's losing very, very slowly. I mean, painfully slowly. It's a step back. And it depends on, of course, looking at who he's losing to. What we don't want is for him to lose to ISIS. We want him to lose to some form of successor government that can in some way rebuild Syria, not destroy it further, in the way this works. And that's a question which we may want to come back to, actually. What does a post-Assad Syria look like, and how does this work with all the various factions that are in there? But to answer the second point of what you asked, looking at the region as a whole, I think there's certainly been a perception in the last few years that the West has withdrawn from active engagement in the way that we had seen under the Bush administration, for example. I say the West because it's mainly America we're talking about here. If you look at the pattern of America's engagement in the Middle East, there's been withdrawal since President Obama came in, slowly masked by the various interludes in between. That has continued, and I think you've seen that play out in terms of how the Iran the Saudi Arabia issue has played out in that. I think what you've seen is that the Saudis and other Gulf states, and Israel to an extent, have felt that America is abandoning their defence. They've always been reliant upon this point, and this has been echoed by many an Arab leader over the last few years. And the Iranians must have, at some level, have got the sense that the Americans are less willing than before to be engaged in this, probably because of the legacy of 10 years of engagement in Iraq and beyond. Now, again, how this plays out, we'll only get to see in the next couple of years. Iran has been the big winner so far. If you look at what's happened in the past 2-3 years since the Arab Spring, Iran is now in Iraq, ensconced there, firmly in control of large tranches of the country. It's in Syria, of course, propping up the Assad regime. It's maintaining its presence in Lebanon. It's had this interlude in Yemen, of course, with the Houthi support as well. Iran is on the ascendant, and I think that has unnerved a lot of America's traditional allies in the region. And that, I think, is a question mark over what we in the West want to do about that going forward.
Thank you. Jen, I want to turn to you. Following what Alan just said, maybe it's not bad that the superpowers will withdraw back from the region. We've seen what happened when Sykes-Picot, when the superpowers try to impose their structure of how states should be over I would say, tribal maybe in some places, maybe, more traditional or just other mental elements of society. And overall, maybe the UK, as maybe the US, is now investing on the Arab states like Turkey, Iran, Egypt, a stable one, and they should not try to impose something like new Sykes-Picot on the region, because we're just seeing now what happened when we try to impose our state of mind on a region that does not share ours.
Thank you. Well, I think many people in the Middle East do crave more self-determination, for sure, but that there is a lot of anxiety in the short term about the lack of order in the region. It's fascinating that this perception exists that the US is pulling back when there's actually absolutely no evidence of it whatsoever. You have, the phrase pivot to Asia, you have some speculation that the shale gas revolution will make the US less interested in the Gulf countries. But beyond that, we don't see any serious evidence that Western countries are any less interested in the Middle East, and there are some issues that keep drawing them back in.
Maybe not evidence of withdrawal, but just thinking about what President W. Bush had done, invading Iraq. It's almost inconceivable right now with Obama doing the same thing. So maybe in the interest, maybe in public statement, yes, but overall on the ground, Obama seems very reluctant to go anywhere in the same area where George W. Bush has been.
There's definitely far less of an appetite for some kind of Iraq-style military intervention. I'm sure that will remain the case in Syria, and I think that is something that is actually respected by the majority public opinion in the Arab world, although we hear a lot from the elites in the Gulf countries who are frustrated, particularly actually with David Cameron, for losing the vote in Parliament over the Syria airstrikes. When you look at polling in the Arab countries where opinion polls can take place, then again and again the majority of the public don't want to see Western boots on the ground in Syria, and it's not at all clear that boots on the ground in Iraq would be the answer either. Let's not forget we have had quite a prolonged period of Western occupation.
I'm not being judgmental.
It's one of the tools that some of the more extreme groups have used to radicalise, to say this government that we have is illegitimate because it only exists because foreigners put it there. So I don't think it's necessarily a solution.
Thanks. Oded, talking a little bit about the Israeli perspective, Prime Minister Netanyahu keeps reiterating, saying that the new order, or the peace order, is opening new horizons for Israel in the region, in cooperating with moderate Sunni states like Saudi Arabia and others. And two questions for you, please. First of all, is it likely that countries like Saudi Arabia will be accepting to publicly open partnership with Israel, publicly, without Israel paying a great deal of price in the Palestinian track, which now seems blocked? And second, being a Jordan expert for Jordan, since 5 years ago, everyone is speaking if Jordan is going to fall apart. Can you say a few words about that? Is it around the corner, or for many reasons, what we've seen happen so quickly in Libya or even Egypt, cannot be happening in Jordan so fast?
Number one, Moav, on the Sykes-Picot, and I'm glad that you raised it. Sykes-Picot, what they did, by the way, there was a Russian involved as well, but it is forgotten. They divided the Middle East in areas to two areas of influence. They did not create at the time states, except states that already existed. When they did help the creation of states afterwards, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they helped to overcome, or to not to overcome, to disregard the tribal, the ethnic, the religious divisions. And what happens today is the possibility that the breakdown of states like Syria, Iraq, and other, Libya, Sudan, which was already broken to officially to two states, they will bring back all the rivalry, tribal, ethnic, religious, cultural, political, over resources. And what it means is that you can erase, retire the world stability from the region, from the Middle East for the next 10 years at least. Because all of them will be battling among themselves. As we see, by the way, there was I would say, a symbolic battle last week in a small remote place on the border between Syria and Iraq.
The last checkpoint, I guess.
Yeah.
It was the last checkpoint that was not held by ISIL.
Right, Tel Abyad, where ISIS was kicked out. And it's not far from the capital of ISIS in Syria, Raqqa, 50, 60 kilometers? Which is symbolic in the sense because the Kurds, after the attacks, the area attacks by the coalition, the Kurds took over the city, pushed out, cleansed the city from Arabs who were living there, crossed the border into Turkey, and now they're coming back under the pressure of a few British and Americans. It's symbolic. But going back to your question, I categorically almost deny the possibility that there will be a public aspect to whatever happens between us and the Saudis, unless there is some, even a symbolic movement or the peace treaty between, on the relations between Israel and the Palestinians. I think that it's impossible to conceive the Saudis, no matter how hard-pressed they may be in possible situation, I doubt it.
Just to challenge you, you're not talking about another settlement freeze or another round of negotiation. You're talking about before creation of the Palestinian states, or we can be well enough with something in between?
Well enough is a better definition of what the Saudis need to become publicly engaged with Israel. It would be much better if there's more than that from their point of view. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is aware of that. It doesn't preclude possible meetings somewhere in the Middle East, somewhere in Europe, with auspices of third party or not, but I doubt that they will go. I don't think that this can happen in the absence of any movement in the Palestinian-Israeli scene. Now, going to your question on Joe. I was there 10 days ago, and I had talks with my friends in government. And number one, they are very appreciative of what Israel does, which goes to the question of what Israel can do in the foreseeable future and situation in the Middle East. They are appreciative of the contribution in water. There are 1.5 at least million Syrian refugees in Jordan. And the Jordanian king, when he goes to Europe, he says it's like the whole of Holland, not just Amsterdam, the whole of Holland invading France. And so, obviously, in a country which is totally arid, or almost totally arid, no own water sources, additional water from Israel is a necessity, not a luxury, it's a necessity. And so, we are contributing in terms of water. The natural gas, there was a pipeline taking natural gas from Egypt to Jordan through the Sinai. The Sinai is now half controlled by terrorists of all kinds. And the pipeline was blown up 15 times. And now the poor Jordanians have to bring, until we complete the negotiations of the pipeline, they have to rely on expensive Qatari gas. So we will provide them with natural gas when this whole issue is settled in Israel. We give them, and I cannot go into details, a lot in terms of security. And so, and the Prime Minister promised that there will be tens of thousands of worshippers going to the Haram al-Sharif, to the Temple Mount, and they are going, they have a frightened fact. In spite of all the security, terror threats and alerts in Israel, they are going. And the Jordanians who are feeling that they are the custodians for the Muslim places in Jerusalem, they are very happy about this achievement. I don't think that the Jordanians worry about a frontal attack by ISIS on Jordan. ISIS will be so terribly stupid, and I don't think that they are stupid in any sense. They are, you cannot understand certain aspects of ISIS, but they're not stupid. And they will not commit, in my view, the mistake of attacking frontally Jordan. But what you see is they're creeping into the base of support for the Hashemite people. In tribes that are traditionally the support base of the regime.
Bearing in mind that around, roughly speaking, 60% of the population in Jordan are Palestinians, right?
Yeah, there are arguments about it, but yes. And the 40% are now, not all of them are under the influence of ISIS, but there are pockets of unemployment. In Jordan, the official unemployment is about 15%. Among the young generation, it's 30%. In a place called Man, which is the capital, quote unquote, of the south, 40 or 50%. And Daesh can go in with money, small money, and bribe a couple of people who will create a problem which will set up the fire. And this happened not by Daesh, but because of the poverty, the unemployment, etc. It happened years ago, before Daesh was even born. And so there is this danger. Now I can't believe, put it this way, that among the 1.5 million refugees that poured from Syria into Jordan, there were not cells of all sorts of anti-regime groups, Nusra, ISIL, you name them, 40 different groups on the go, already on the Golan. Already there is a danger that they will go further beyond the border. The Jordanians are now working very closely with the Syrian Free Army in order to create this sort of what is called a security zone on the Syrian side, hoping, I don't know, that something will emerge from that some of the refugees can be returned to the other side of the border. I doubt it is well. So basically, Jordan is not about to fall, certainly not in the foreseeable future, but there are dangers. And unfortunately for the Jordanians, the major paymasters, not the West. The problem with the assistance which comes from the West is the money that comes from the West is kosher. You cannot put the money in envelopes and go around and give it to the sheikhs and the tribes leaders in the South. Every cent or penny has to be accounted for. The money that you could use comes from the Gulf, or should come from the Gulf, and there's less and less money coming from the Gulf.
Thank you. So we will open for the public to ask. I encourage you to direct a certain question to a certain member of the panel here. Yes, sir.
Jonathan Paris, Middle East analyst. You've been focusing on ISIS in Levant so far, but what about ISIS more broadly, the branding of ISIS and the vulnerability in places like, I don't know, Boko Haram area, Sinai, other areas where they're back in Libya? Where do you see the trend lines?
Either of you?
It's clearly become the new franchise that a lot of other groups want to bandwagon on, and certainly we can see that calling yourself an Islamic State affiliate is the most surefire way to get media attention and probably policymakers' attention as well. Libya had basically fallen off the agenda of most international policymakers except the Italians until ISIS were there, hitting people, making a video and so forth. So I think that we will see other groups in other countries trying to jump on this bandwagon, but that when we're looking to the solutions, we need to disaggregate those groups, disaggregate that complexity and really look at the very different local factors at play in each place. So as not to give Islamic State too much credit for what may really be a patchwork of very diverse local conflicts that have all got this new stamp.
I'd agree with that, and the only thing I'd add is that I think one of the differences between ISIL and Al-Qaeda is that ISIL, they do seem to be focused on creating a caliphate across particularly Syria and Iraq, and are less focused on attacking the West or branching out to regional places. And so it's a different type of mindset. And so when we're looking at it, yes, we hear about all these groups who are affiliating themselves to ISIL, but we try very hard to try and work out if they really are, if there are actual links between ISIL HQ, if you like, and these other groups. You know, are they sending resources? Are they sending people? Are they sending advice? Are they helping with strategy and policy? And I think probably they are a bit with Libya, but I think it's much more tenuous with any of the other groups. And so just because somebody waves a black flag and says, we're ISIL now, doesn't mean that we necessarily treat them as such.
Maybe just be short with it because we have a bunch of...
Yeah, that's comment on Gaza too, ISIS.
Just to add a few sort of facts. There is a danger that if the success on the ground continues in the Middle East, it will affect other regions in the world. China, more than 60 million Muslims. They are terrified. Chinese terrified. It sounds like an oxymoron, but there it is. They are afraid of the influence, the psychological influence of creating a political entity in China, in the Middle East and then in China. Indonesia, with over 200 million Muslims, the same. Malaysia. So this is one region. You speak to officials in Britain, Germany. Once again, the fear that you will have experts, quote unquote, coming back from the Middle East in explosives, in guerrilla, in street fighting, and they will bring more zealots into their midst. So there is, if there is a continued success on the ground, can be perceived as success, then states, either in Asia, Europe, in the Middle East, less, because people are watching TV. People are watching TV in Jordan and East Jerusalem, and what they see, they take it very, very cautiously.
Thanks.
Mentioned before that Iran is a major benefactor from what is happening. Is there a logic here of outsourcing the fight, since you don't want to have boots on the ground, of outsourcing the fight to the Iranians in a major battlefield? And what is going to be the outcome of an Iranian deal on the nuclear issue on that war against the radical extremists?
Ellen and then Dan.
I'm minded of the famous Kissinger quote about Iraq and Iran fighting one another. Can't they both lose in this way? I mean, the issue is, yes, we have, there's been an outsourcing of a kind on the ground war. I think the Americans have tacitly, kind of accepted that's been the case, with the Iranian side coming in with the Iraqi government. Once they left, of course, the Iranians rushed to fill the void. The Americans weren't keen to re-emerge. Although there is now some talk about actually we've allowed the Iranians too much latitude on the ground in Washington, and the feel that there needs to be some kind of pushback around this. It's difficult to see how that can happen though without any ground forces to actually replenish the ones that Iran is supplying. Now, the issue really, if you look at how the Iranians have taken advantage of this, it's been quite masterful. They have kind of secured diplomatic advantage from this in the region. Of course, they've had some opposition from other sources as well. But from their perspective of building up a power project, it's been working very well indeed. And the real question, therefore, has to be whether any deal that's reached on a nuclear framework actually then goes further in the next stage, if there is a next stage, and starts to address the other issues. I was mindful of our own ambassador, Peter Westmacott, speaking just a couple of weeks ago on the Charlie Rose show, when he was asked the question quite rightly, well, hang on, you're doing this deal with Iran, a regime which does X, Y, and Z in the region, supports terror, it intervenes in its neighbours, it's helping Assad kill Syria. How does this square? And his line was, yes, we accept that these bad things are happening, but we feel the nuclear issue is so important, we must reach agreement on that first, and then we can look at other behaviour. Now, the bet that the British ambassador in that case was making, that others, I think it's fair to say, are making, is that if you start with a nuclear deal, that then enables you to progress into other deals. The counter-argument, of course, is that if you allow them to get away with everything else they've been doing, which we have allowed them to get away with, giving them a deal on the nuclear side merely emboldens and encourages them to continue in that area. Now, this is the question none of us know the answer to. It's where you sit on that equation that I think matters.
I think two things. One is whose war is it in Iraq? And I think that we risk thinking it's our war when in fact it's the Iraqi government's war really, and we're helping them. And so it's worth thinking it through that way. But also, what are the Iranians trying to achieve? Now, it might be that we share some tactical, not strategic, but tactical objectives with the Iranians, which is pushing back ISIL. But that if you are worried about Iranian influence in Iraq, then there's kind of they themselves are aware that if they push too far with the Shia militia, then there's going to be a backlash against them. And they are aware that actually the Sunni tribes and Sunni communities need to be empowered and protected by other Sunni communities, not by Iranian-led forces or Shia militias. And so that there's actually, there's this element which is actually having to temper Iranian action. So I think it's a very complicated dynamic that you've got there. And undoubtedly, Prime Minister Vardi is walking a political tightrope between the pressure and influence that he's getting from Tehran with what he knows he needs to do to have a more sustainable political environment, which is to reach out to the Sunni communities.
Okay, here's the deal. If you will be short in your questions, and you distinguished panelists will be short in your answers, we can make it to maybe 3 or 4. If not, we will be able to take only 2, so please.
Simple question, what about the role of Turkey in this?
Role of Turkey, let's take few. Yes, sir.
Are the lines drawn up after the Ottoman Empire between Syria and Iraq completely gone now? now that ISIS have taken over the various territories, or can they be redrawn on a similar basis again?
Okay, and another question? Yes, sir.
The worst thing you can say on campus to an anti-Israel activist is compare Hamas and ISIL as similar things. In your opinion, what is, if any, an ideological difference between the two?
You direct your question to a certain panelist?
I don't mind. Go
Okay. So we have 3 questions, gentlemen and
Lady?
lady.
Could you repeat the last one? Sorry.
Yeah. So we had, first of all, what the role of Turkey. Second, can the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire, that was the question?
The border.
The border, about the border between the two. And the third question, people used to say, my prime minister said it in the UN General Assembly, ISIS is Hamas, Hamas is ISIS. Is it so? So let's take notes from each one of you, but please remain short. Oded.
Turkey is a very important factor. You cannot deny just by the size, by the location, by the common borders it has. I think that the West, quote unquote, lost Iraq Turkey by, I won't go into this whole issue of the entry into the EU. There is a possibility that the defeat in the elections recently somehow moderate Erdogan, I'm not so sure. But when finally the dust settles in Iraq and in Syria, if it settles down, Turkey will be an important factor. Coming back to the issue of the border, the borders between Turkey and its southern borders will not change. What will matter is what happens south of the border. The border will continue to be the border. And I will stop here.
Okay.
On ISIS and Hamas, I guess I'd turn around the question and say, what's the similarity between the two, other than they're both Muslim groups that endorse some kind of political violence? Other than that, most of their aspirations, rhetoric, political behaviour, etc., is different. And you'll find a large constellation of different groups who use some kind of interpretation of Islam and some kind of endorsement of political violence, very, very different contexts. The border between Iraq and Syria can ever be reinstated. It's probably a very long way off if that ever is to happen. It's probably the most questionable part of the kind of Sykes-Picot inheritance. But I would note that most of the political leaders in Iraq are calling for the country to be separated, and particularly among the Arab Iraqi political leaders, there are deep differences between Sunni and Shia Iraqis on how they interpret Iraqi history and how they interpret Iraq's future, but they're not calling for separate Sunni stands and Shia stands. They want their group and their interpretation of history to be the dominant one in a larger Iraq with Baghdad as the capital. So I think that there is actually a stronger and more resilient Iraqi nationalism than many people think at present. And just on Turkey, I think it's difficult at present for the Western countries to cooperate with most of their regional allies in fighting Islamic State because they've got a very fundamental difference of opinion on what needs to happen in Syria, whether Assad should go. But probably the most useful thing that could happen would be if you were able to build on the fact that Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Iran are all threatened by Islamic State and actually get some kind of cooperation between those three regional powers. That would be fantastic, but very far from becoming a reality because currently they all blame each other for the problem.
My response on Turkey is that it's vitally important in fighting ISIL. Fighters come in through Turkey, resources go in through Turkey, stuff is smuggled out into Turkey. Turkey controls the airspace around there. Turkey has military bases that could be used, and Turkey has a lot to lose if things go wrong. And so Turkey is an absolutely vital partner. And I think we in the international community need to make sure that we are listening to what Turkey is saying and not just telling Turkey what Turkey needs to do. Iraq-Syria border, I think it can be reinstated. I think the big difference at the moment is that there is a government of Iraq and there's not a government of Syria. So it's not impossible to envisage ISIL being pushed out of Iraq and a border being created. But as you say, it's not going to be happening very quickly.
Just to go on the border point straight away, it's true, borders could be reconstituted, but what won't be reconstituted, I feel, are the peoples who used to live there and have been tragically driven out over the past 5-10 years, the minorities, the Christians, the Yazidis, others who've been, who've lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years in the region and no longer there. So yes, we could see some kind of state construct. You've seen that even in Europe with the fallen parts of Yugoslavia, the state borders tended to reform even if in slightly different ways. It's possible to achieve that. It just really, what kind of state do you have under that? And then if you look at the Turkey question, of course Turkey has a role to play in this, but I think we should pretend that Turkey has tried to play several games in the last few years, and quite badly as it's now turned out, in the region, for obvious reasons. I mean, on the one hand, you have the sort of the great power pretensions of the Erdogan regime, how it's attempted to push itself as a regional power, and it's a dying of death now because its chosen allies in this Muslim Brotherhood have pretty much lost out in that. So there's that aspect. Secondly, the issue of the Kurds has, of course, compound any attempt to engage in the Syria issue because, yes, while they are threatened, of course, by ISIL, at the same time, they will be threatened by the idea of some kind of Kurdish headland, although relations have been improving of late. There is that factor to consider as well. So it's unclear how the Turks will move forward. One thing we do know is that they could, if they wanted to, play a much bigger role, including on the ground. There's a million troops sitting there, just sitting there right now. There are possibilities that they could do more in that respect. I would argue follow. And one quick point just from James. Yes, well, I accept entirely there are very big differences between Hamas and ISIL. Of course there are in that way. At the same time, we mustn't forget that the wellspring of Islamist thought that all that Al-Qaeda, ISIS have drawn from starts with the Muslim Brotherhood. That's where it starts from. If you look at Sayyid Qutb's journey, for example, from the Brotherhood into the ideology that eventually inspired others in Al-Qaeda, that's where it came from. So there clearly is a movement on that continuum. They're in different places now. That doesn't mean at some point they're waiting to converge, or people can converge on either side.
We could have going on for another hour, but sadly enough we have to stop now. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, members of the panel.